I will never, and I mean never, forget the time that we had a male sub in high school and a girl asked to go to the restroom and he said sure. So she grabbed something and he heard a wrapper and he was like, oh, if you're going to eat candy, you can do it in here, but you have to share with everyone in the class. And she was like, what? And he was like, well, I heard the wrapper. And she whips out a tampon, shoves it in his face, and she goes, you want to share? Oh, girl, savage.
Remember this client who got screwed over by her ex? Well, she came back for an appointment with more stories. After getting somewhat back on her feet, she decided to take a much-needed getaway to visit her best friend up in New York City. She thought she could turn to her friend for guidance and support, but she was wrong. After moving to New York City, her friend changed. She became mentally and emotionally abusive both to herself and others. My client had a rude awakening when she was left outside in a city she didn't know, while her so-called best friend got high on horse tranquilizers with a complete stranger. After all of that, my client stuck around to see if she was okay, just to find her strutting down her rooftop ledge, threatening her life. She was ready to end the friendship, but realized her friend needed more help and support than she ever did. I never really talk about myself on here, but I think this is a story worth sharing. I was born with a birthmark in the center of my forehead. It looked very similar to a traditional bindi worn in the Hindu culture. I was told all my life by my family what a blessing it is to have this beauty mark because of its meaning, but unfortunately others thought differently. I would get weird looks from random strangers and was bullied at school for most of my childhood. Kids would call me ugly and worthless. No one even wanted to be my friend or sit next to me at lunch. And for what? Just because someone looks a little different or has something unique about them? Back then I really cared about what others thought. I took words to heart, and because of that I lacked confidence for years. And I'm positive I'm not the only one. I wish someone told me this back then, but being unique isn't a bad thing. It only makes you stronger. Embrace it.
Honestly, I love and appreciate all my clients, but I have this specific client who honestly gets on my freaking nerves. She's literally always like 20 minutes late, and she shows up and still has the audacity to be eating her food. Not to mention, every time I pull her hand forward, she tends to pull it back. And I don't mind people being on their phone, but with both hands, I don't think it's okay. Or looking at the nails when I'm not even finished and judging them. I just find it so disrespectful that I'm giving her my full attention and she's doing her own damn thing. Even though she kept moving and being on her phone, the shape still came out super good. And I was able to get the apex on point. And then this bitch still has the nerve to look at them before I'm even done. Apart from that, she's so rude and she literally doesn't ever want to pay me. Always has excuses and says that she doesn't have money. I'm just so sick and tired of her always taking advantage of me. Like, damn, stay still, bitch.
So the EMTs finally get her to calm down, and they start talking to her and asking her a few questions, and I see one of the EMTs walk out, and I'm guessing it's to check her information. And when he walks back in, he says something to the other EMT, and they say that they're going to call for the police and that she's not in trouble. A few minutes later, a police officer shows up, and I'm so confused because I don't know what's going on. So he walks in, and it's pretty obvious that he recognizes her. He even calls her by her first name. He's talking to her, and I hear him tell her that she's supposed to be at the hospital, and asked her how she got out and what she's doing out here so late. Now, I was on the other side of the lobby, and she answered his questions so quietly, so I didn't get to hear what she said. But then he tells her, okay, well, why don't you get in my car and we'll drive you back. So she agrees, and they all get ready to leave, and I hear the officer say to the EMT, yeah, she's supposed to be at the mental hospital. She escaped twice this week. She does this all the time. So they tell me bye and walk out the door, and I'm standing there in shock because I thought it was a girl having health problems, but it was actually a mental patient who escaped the mental hospital.
This is why you should never answer the door late at night. A woman woke up to a knock at her door. When she opened the door, no one was there, so she went back to bed. A few hours later, she woke up again to a loud noise. She looked to her window and saw the word smile written in the frost. She reached over to call 911, but saw that a post-it note was stuck on her phone and it said, I told you to smile. She ran out of the house, called the police, but nothing was found. The next night, she decided to put a camera in her room. But she could have never predicted what those cameras would show her. At 3 a.m., something crawled out from underneath her bed. It was a tall, pale man with no clothes and bulging veins all over his head. He walked over to the camera until his face took up the entire shot. Then his mouth widened into an unnaturally large smile. He just stared at the camera like that for hours, not blinking. The woman skipped the video until she saw herself getting out of bed and picking up the camera. And that was the last thing the cameras recorded, which meant the man never left her house. This is why you should never take a prank too far. Once there were two young twins who lived in a small town and they were known for constantly misbehaving. One day a man had passed away peacefully in his home and the twins wanted to play a prank on everyone else living in the town, so they snuck into the house and started messing with the man's body. One twin moved his mouth like a puppet and the other one poked his eyes out with a stick. As they were doing this, they heard footsteps. They couldn't find anywhere to hide, so they placed the body back in the coffin, then got in the coffin themselves and closed the lid. But what they didn't know was they were taking the coffin straight to the funeral. The people carrying the coffin noted that it was much heavier than usual but brushed it off. No one even noticed that the twins were gone until the coffin was lowered. The twins' mother appeared at the cemetery about the missing twins, which stopped the funeral and began a search. Eventually, the man carrying the coffin confessed that the coffin had weighed more than it was supposed to, so they lifted it out and opened the lid. They did find the boys there, but they found them lying on top of the body, whose hands were wrapped tightly around each of their necks. The twins had been strangled to death.
Storytime Tinder edition. Okay, the story blew up on Twitter like a while ago, but I'm just gonna retell it because it's very informational. So there was this guy and this girl, and they met through Tinder, and then they met up and they went on this date. And they were out at dinner, and then she starts not feeling so well. And then she says, I really need to go home. And he says, yeah, I'll drive you home. And she says, okay. So then they get to her house, and then she starts feeling better. So then she says, do you want to come in for some coffee? And then he says, yeah, sure. So they go inside, they have their coffee, and then she doesn't feel well again. And she's like, oh, I'm sorry, I don't feel well again. I think you really need to leave. And he's like, okay. And he leaves. And then she goes to bed, and in the middle of the night, she wakes up, and she hears this noise down in her kitchen. And so she locks her door, and she calls the cop. And the 911 operator is just on the other line saying, can you just stay on the line until the cops get there? And then the cops get there and they're like, the door is locked. Like, we don't think anyone's inside. And she's like, I promise you, someone's inside my house. I can hear them. She says, you have my permission to break down the door. So she's still up in her room, and then she hears the cops break down the door. And then she hears some wrestling and some fighting. Part 2.
Okay, so this is a story time of when I worked at this fast food restaurant. So I was a lobby closer after I got out of school. I go to work and I wouldn't get out till like 12 or 1 in the morning. At this store, lobby closed at 10 p.m. and one of the rules were that at 10 you lock the doors and no one is allowed to come in at all. So this one night it was raining outside. It was already past 10 and I hear someone knocking on the door. So I look up to see who's knocking and I see this girl. She looks like she's 16 or 17. Her hair is where her clothes is wet and she waves at me and she points at the door. Now people do this all the time. They would be drunk or something trying to get something to eat and I would just tell them that we're closed and they would leave. So I mouth, we're closed, and I see her say please, and she points at her chest. So I walk up to the door and this is a glass door, so when you're close you could hear the other person talking, and I say your chest, and she says yes, I can't breathe. So instantly I'm like, well shit, I'm not gonna leave her out in the rain not breathing. So I call for my manager and I let him know that I'm gonna let her in, and he's not happy about it, but he lets me do it anyways. So as soon as I open the door she walks in, and this is when things took a turn for the worst.
Part 2. So yeah, there was a guy outside the window. So yes, I did lock all the doors and everything. I made sure everything was secure. I closed the blinds. So for the rest of the night, nothing else really happened other than this really weird thump. It was like someone was knocking on a window. Allow me to demonstrate. I ignored it because I was in denial that this was happening. The rest of the night was normal. The parents came home. I drove really fast home. And then the next morning I wake up. And apparently, an old man with Alzheimer's had escaped from his little home. I did not know this because it was dark outside, and even if I did see him outside the window, I wouldn't have known this. But he was naked. Naked. So it wasn't like a mass murderer outside the window, but it was a naked man with Alzheimer's looking at me through a window. It's not every teenage girl's dream, but it's really weird just knowing that a naked old man was staring at me through a window.
Storytime about the boy across the street who used to stalk me. So a little background information. My parents and I moved into a new house that was literally 5 minutes from where I used to live. But I went to private school, and almost all the other kids in my town went to the public school. So I didn't really know a lot of the kids in my town. Well, a week after we moved in, our neighbors across the street invited us to a barbecue. While we were there, I started talking to our neighbor's older son, and him and I started to get along really well. Like, in a flirty way. Their older son was a senior, I was a sophomore, and their younger son was a freshman. Well, I kind of talked to the younger son, but he was just like giving me really weird vibes. So for the next few weeks, I started hanging out with their older son a lot, and we would talk all the time. Well, the one day whenever I went over their house, it was super weird. His younger brother kept saying, oh, I think I know you from somewhere. Like, I swear I know you. And I'm just like, okay. Well, the one morning I was waiting outside for my mom to pick me up because she worked night shifts and she would just grab me and then take me to my school. And I saw him in his window watching me like for part 2. Part 2 about how I catfished all the popular boys in my school and they found out about it. So like I said, the one kid said, "Oh, I never saw you at my school." So then I just blocked him, and thankfully that situation got left alone. Well, then after that, like I said, we started talking to all the other popular boys. We're gonna call this Catfish Ashley. Well, at that point, everybody knew who Ashley was. Like, I would literally be sitting in class and all the girls would be talking about how much they hate Ashley, how Ashley's such a hoe. Like, all the girls despised her. Sorry, her. And they kind of had a reason to, because we broke up so many relationships and everything. Well, the one night I'm having a sleepover with my friends. Well, Kate asked if she could come to the sleepover as if it wasn't obvious that she could come. Just a quick reminder, Kate was the one who I started the account with. So I was joking around with her and I was like, "No, you can't come." So I wake up the next morning, right? And all the popular boys are blowing up my phone on my actual accounts, like for part 3.
This is why waking up late might just save your life. One day when I was in elementary school, my mom and I both overslept, which meant I wouldn't be ready in time to get on the bus. School started at 8, my bus pickup time was at 7, and it was already 6:40 or something. I was still in my PJs and hadn't even had breakfast yet. My mom decided that today we would just tell the bus driver to go on ahead and she would take me to school, which would give me plenty of time to get ready. It's 6:50, I'm in my PJs eating breakfast, and that's when we hear the bus pull up 10 minutes earlier than scheduled. My mom peeks her head out of the door into the foggy morning and waves the bus on. She closed the door and came back inside, but the bus didn't pull away. There's a knock at the door and my mom opens it to find a man in a bus driver uniform. He explains he's a substitute bus driver because the regular driver called in sick and that he's early because he wanted to get an early start on the route. My mom says she's taking me to school because we woke up late. He gets visibly upset and says he can wait a few minutes since he's already ahead of schedule. My mom says that we won't be ready in a few minutes and tells him to go on ahead. He seemed really angry about this, but turned around, got back on the bus and left. But at 7 a.m., another bus pulls up to my house. My mom went out to talk to them and came back looking terrified.